you very much. Thank you. Well, with that introduction, I could open on Broadway, if only I could get there. At the end, when you were talking about the importance of reading and literature, I was thinking, well, I've thought it before, but I'll quote myself, that if everyone had read Huckleberry Finn, Donald Trump couldn't have been elected. You remember the Duke and the King, is that right? The King and the Duke, these two ridiculous poseurs, imposters, phonies, salesmen who impose themselves on Huck and Jim. There's a wonderful display of conmanship. What I'm going to do is a ramble, not a lecture. I mean, I'm a journalist, not a professor, as you know. It seems appropriate also to this moment. I feel like we're living in a state of disintegrated consciousness. Things are pulling at us from all sides. There's a sense of crisis and turmoil day after day. MSNBC's Chuck Todd, I just happened to turn it on at 5 o'clock, and he said, I can't take this anymore. He started sounding like Howard Beale in Network. And then he went for like 5 minutes listing everything that he thought was crazy about the Trump administration. 5 minutes, one thing after another. It feels like it's impossible to catch up to the present. I mean, particularly people my age feel that they're being rushed off their feet all the time. My friends don't want to admit it. I admit it and make books out of it. But digitization increases the rate of acceleration, not just the basic tempo, but the rate of acceleration. So I want to talk about the surround, as Paul called it, and my own periodic efforts, some of which you just heard, to pull back from the noise. They'll begin by giving you an absolutely accurate picture of the world. Absolutely truthful and accurate. On 9/11, thousands and thousands of Arab Muslims stood on the roofs in New Jersey cheering the site of the World Trade Center coming down. Before the election, more than a dozen women conspired and were paid to accuse Donald Trump of assaulting them sexually. These women are all liars. They will be sued. Foreign terrorists are entering as refugees and threatening the country. The people coming across the southern borders are rapists and drug dealers. The president was elected in an electoral college landslide, but lost the popular vote only because 3 million fraudulent voters. The crowds at the inauguration were massive, the largest crowds ever. Some outside power may have interfered with the 2016 presidential election, but who knows who it is? Who the hell knows what's going on? The DNC could have been hacked by Russia, China, or some 400-pound creature sitting on his bed, and so on. More things that are absolutely true. The president has never had any dealings whatsoever with Russia, and no one in his campaign has any dealings whatsoever or any relations with Russia. The entire Russia investigation is a hoax devised by Democrats to make up for losing the election and carried out by large portions of the FBI who are engaged in a conspiracy to destroy the president. Okay? All of that is absolutely true. Now I'm going to give you a biased picture, a false, haplessly partisan picture. If you want to call it the view from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, that's fine. Maybe the view from Kalamazoo also. The president won 304 electoral college votes. Obama won 332 in 2012, 365 in 2008. Clinton defeated Dole with 379. In 1992, Clinton won against President George H.W. Bush with 370. The crowds at the inauguration the Trump inauguration were considerably smaller than the crowds at Barack Obama's inauguration. The CIA, FBI, and NSA agree that the Russians interfered in our election in many different ways. More falsehoods. Immigrants have a lower crime rate than native-born Americans. The president hasn't sued the women who came forward, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I'm teasing, flipping realities that have been flipped too many times for us, almost at the point of despair. Well, not quite despair. The Bible says despair is unforgivable. It's in Corinthians, it's in other places. Everyone I know actually is in a state of constant obsessional rage, not despair. For it is, of course, the first set of statements that is false, the second that is true. And just asserting that means grasping at sanity when insanity is being officially propounded for political advantage. We are not only in a political crisis, we are in a psychological and spiritual crisis. How do we know what we know? And what do we know and how do we know it? Trump administration is not just lying for specific gains. Well, they do that too, but they are trying to reshape our reality, our sense of reality. And sometimes just for the hell of it, because a significant proportion of the population will believe complete fabrications. What we have is a situation of tribal epistemology. That's what David Roberts, a political writer for Vox, a political online magazine, called it. Here's Roberts. Information is evaluated based not on conformity to common standards of evidence or correspondence to a common understanding of the world, but on whether it supports the tribe's values and goals and is vouchsafed by tribal leaders. Good for our side and true begin to blur into one. I have to insist the situation of the two tribes, as he calls it, is asymmetrical. Hillary's voters got their news from a variety of sources. Trump's overwhelmingly from Fox and right-wing talk radio. CNN and MSNBC, the two liberal networks, cable news networks, have their conservative commentators on regularly as frequent guests, even as staff, and they're treated respectfully. Anyone left of Newt Gingrich who goes on Fox is greeted with a kind of smirk, the Fox smirk, as if such views from a Democrat were so absurd that they couldn't possibly be taken seriously. CNN admits mistakes, even fires journalists who make mistakes, who file false report. They filed 2 veteran journalists last year. Fox perpetrates paranoid myths and keeps them going despite all evidence or the lack of evidence. But here's the problem. 35 to 40% of the country lives in this reverse reality through the looking glass, down the rabbit hole, Lewis Carroll, without much fun. And they're unlikely to come up for air, as far as anyone can tell. And there's been a lot of psychological studies, sociology and psychology. Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, other people like that who have shown through experiments that logic, reason, argument, the whole battery of persuasive, sweet or hostile exercises very rarely change people's minds when they have dug deep into certain convictions. And just for the record, educated liberals are just as bad, if not worse, because they pride themselves on their judgment, on considering factors before they make a judgment, on weighing evidence. And then once they've made a judgment, it's very hard to change it. I have found that across the breakfast table. What does change people's minds? Well, loss of income, loss of social status, or maybe an accession of income and social status. It said of Trump voters that they're sensing cultural destruction, not just the loss of jobs, which industries disappearing, jobs disappearing, but a sense of cultural certainty. And this is where I'm not even going to go any further, because the only thing I can do with Trump voters is listen, because I don't understand. I don't understand why, for instance, gay marriage should be a threat to anyone. I live, my wife and I live in New York. We're a member of a minority. They're called white people. 44% of New York. It's fine. In fact, it's great. So I will return to this in a separate context. Liberal democracy flourishes, everyone agrees, with certain structures, and it requires certain norms, certain behaviors, even manners, a word I never thought I would use with this kind of force behind it. Among them, recognizing the legitimacy of the opposition, not assuming that anyone disagrees with you is treasonous, a betrayer. Trust. You expect if people make promises, they'll keep them, and if you make promises, you'll keep them. What's called forbearance. Forbearance. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote in his journals, forbearance, good word. His friend Ernest was not forbearing, more of a survivor than Fitzgerald. But in political terms, forbearance means you don't grind your opponent's nose into the dirt. You don't exploit every advantage that you have because you're powerful. Not every advantage. You observe certain limits. You allow the other guy, the other girl to exist. Kristen Gillibrand makes some points about the administration supporting Roy Moore, and Donald Trump implies that she's a slut the next day. That is the absence of forbearance. The president operates on a personal calculus of triumph and humiliation. Our alpha male, the ethos is kill them, eat them, devour them, mate with them, and humiliate them. That's the ethos. Liberal democracy, and I don't mean, you understand, I don't mean liberalism or the Democratic Party. I mean the form of government that we have with its bicameral legislation, its representation, its sense of rights, and so on. Most of all, even more important than legitimizing the opposition, trust, forbearance, is some sort of agreement on an observable fact. Some willingness to accept authoritative data, perhaps, that has been replicated again and again and again. It's very interesting that the systems and structures that depend on factuality and evidence that are most under attack by Trump. I mean, he's attacked everybody. But, Hollywood can take care of itself. Professional football can take care of itself. He assaults the rule of law, which is a system that depends on evidence, the Justice Department and the FBI, which conduct investigations, gathering factual background. I'm not saying that they're free of political motivation. Of course, I'm one of those people who grew up fearing the FBI, ridiculing it when J. Edgar Hoover was the head of it. For decades, liberals hated the FBI because they kept files on ordinary political activity, so on. But I don't think their basic activities post-Hoover are corrupt. If you look at the leaders, who, by the way, have all been Republicans recently, it's hard to see signs of corruption there. J. Edgar Hoover would be shocked by the Republican Party's indifference to Russian incursion into our election. He was obsessed with communism. It's embarrassing to read about the 30s when there were sizable fascist movements like in Los Angeles and New York and places like that, and people would gather information and the FBI didn't even want to hear it. They're only interested in the Reds. That's all. The attack on science, another evidence-based discipline. Constant experimentation, reinterpretation, revision, self-criticism. Of course, one irony is that those who would deny climate change probably want the latest scientific research as it applies to, let's say, medical technology if their children are sick. And they need the latest cures. They're very much pro-science. Or the latest personal technology. If you get a flu shot, I'm told you're a Darwinian. Whether you know it or not, you're a Darwinian. Evolution is behind the way those shots work. The press. No, they're attempting to be fact-based at its best. Good newspapers use multiple sources for stories. They don't just print assertions and rumors. They try to do basic fact-checking. Well, first, there isn't time, often, in newspapers. But if you look at the Washington Post regularly, they say, according to 4 sources. According to 6 sources. They don't simply throw assertions into the paper. Magazines like the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Harper's, and not just national magazines, lots of wonderful local magazines do extensive fact-checking. To publish fake news is humiliating. This is the last thing any journal wants to do because it destroys your reputation and people don't want to talk to you. About journalism, a basic thing to say, and maybe you've heard this many times, but I'll say it anyway. Objectivity is impossible. It doesn't exist. If you're a reporter, as soon as you turn your notebook this way or instead of that way, or if you're a documentary filmmaker and you turn your camera this way instead of that way, you're exercising subjective judgment. One of the great documentary makers of our time, Fred Wiseman, who's made all these extraordinary films about institutions, gathers hundreds, maybe not hundreds, but 100 hours of footage about whatever institution and then he creates what he calls a very subjective view of that institution. It's very complicated. He has a wonderfully rich sensibility, but he's the first one to say this is subjective. If objectivity is impossible, though, fairness is not impossible, which means you don't suppress views that are different from your own. You report them. You weigh them. You don't have to continue honoring them if any evidence for them disappears. You know, that old on the one hand, on the other hand, which can be a betrayal of responsibility. But you don't simply ridicule them. That's fairness. About Michael Wolff's book, I don't know if many of you read Fire and Fury. He's intelligent. He has a good ear for catty remarks around the White House. It's an inside look at the factions in the White House, mainly Bannon versus Jared and Ivanka. But it's not a trustworthy book. He flattered his way in there. 13 months ago, he wrote pieces attacking the liberal press for being too reflexively anti-Trump, which the Trump people noticed. And I suspect he continued flattering his way there. He went there 20 times. He never talked to the president except maybe on the phone. He never talked to Ivanka. It's essentially Steve Bannon's point of view, Fire and Fury. And with the result that Steve Bannon was thrown out of out of Paradise, out of Breitbart and everything else. And Michael Wolff is a cynic. His attitude is that everyone is out for money and power and status and nothing else. No, if you were out for something besides that, there must be something wrong with you. You're phony. So that gives him a certain satirical edge, because he thinks all these people in the White House are awful. It's funny, but I don't trust it. Now we all know, and we've all read probably, that there are ways that truth is shaped by power. You know, Michel Foucault 101. There are no metaphysical truths, no absolute truths, nothing out there that you can grab. Truth is something that exists, as a truth claims exist within discourses, like scientific discourses, like psychiatry, medicine, so on. And truth should always be examined, truth claims should always be examined in relation to power. That's Foucault, which had an enormous influence on the American universities in the 80s and so on. Now you can argue over this, but I don't think Foucaultian skepticism would argue with observable fact. The absence of cheering Arabs on New Jersey roofs, the size of crowds, the disappearance of the ice covering Greenland. Obama said a couple of weeks ago, when evidence itself is dismissed, when it doesn't conform to political desire, you can't really have a conversation. You can only assert your views and nothing is left but power, which is incredibly depressing. But I think that's where we are. Well, what do we do? I mean, we can't wait for history to sort things out. Our political fate as a democracy is being decided right now. The best thing, of course, is political activism. And it's very encouraging to hear how many young women in particular are throwing themselves into all kinds of local political activity. It may have an enormous effect. I'm not much of an activist myself. I took part in plenty of anti-war demonstrations 50 years ago, but after 3 hours of speeches, I would come home and read Henry James. I told this recently to a radical leader from that period, Todd Gitlin, professor at Columbia Journalism School, and I told him, I came home to read Henry James, and he said, "Thank God." So, but people of better temperament than me are throwing themselves into activity, many times, as I say, women who have never been politically active before. What if we don't fight this all the time, every day? I want to quote Václav Havel's essay, The Power of the Powerless, from 1978. Great dissident in communist Czechoslovakia, eventually became president of the Czech Republic. Famous essay that circulated in Samizdat manuscript. Because the regime, the communist regime, is captive to its own lies, it must falsify everything. It falsifies the past, it falsifies the present, and it falsifies the future. It falsifies statistics. It pretends to respect human rights. It pretends to persecute no one. It pretends to fear nothing. It pretends to pretend nothing. And one other classic, Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism. Many people have been quoting this. 1951. Hannah Arendt left Germany after a fantastic education in philosophy, came here and wrote the extraordinary book about Stalinism and Nazism. In an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses in Russia in the 30s and Germany in the 30s, had reached the point where they would at the same time believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and nothing was true. The totalitarian mass leaders based their propaganda on the correct psychological assumption that under such conditions, one could make people believe the most fantastic statements one day and trust that if the next day they were given irrefutable proof of their falsehood, they would take refuge in cynicism. And Arendt said, the result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not merely that the lie will now be accepted as truth and truth be defamed as a lie, but that the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world and the category of truth versus falsehood is among the mental means to this end. The sense by which we take our bearings in the real world is being destroyed. What we're now facing is the necessity to assert at an individual or group level our own sanity day after day. And one longs for restoration of order, logic, public accountability. And I suppose that Bob Mueller is the closest thing we're going to get. He's not metaphysical truth, but he's conducting an investigation dependent on assemblage of facts and evidence and witnesses and so on. And in our fantasies, perhaps, our hopes, he will counterpose law and factuality to power, to arrogant falsehood, to wealth, and so on. And I think the hope is, as I say, not only that we'll get some sort of clarity about the Russia thing, as Trump calls it, but Mueller will begin to reestablish some sort of purchase on the real world for many people. Well, what else besides public activism, living in truth, as Havel calls it, holding on to sanity by constantly asserting it day after day? There's what Voltaire called cultivating your garden at the end of Candide, which, as I said, temperamentally suits me. And when I talk about the humanities, when we all talk about the humanities, we don't mean just academic disciplines. We mean the arts in the broadest sense, reading in the broadest sense, cultivation of oneself and one's society for something more than mere existence. Of course, at the moment, saying anything that smacks of personal sensitivity or sensibility, whatever word you want, seems tame and not very strong in the face of these gusts of ridicule. And that's hard. That's hard to face. This dizzying moment, as I said, of disintegrated consciousness, the sense of being pulled asunder, is a more extreme version of what I felt 25 years ago. I was a film critic. I was then at New York Magazine, and I was very happy in the job. I wrote reviews one place or another for 45 years. But I was feeling overwhelmed by images, also by the 25 years ago version of CNN and opinion everywhere. I felt that I had lost any sense of who I was and what my basic feelings and beliefs were. I felt media was overwhelming culture, let's put it that way, and overwhelming me. So there was a debate going on, which is going to spring up again, and I'm sure you remember it, in a multi-ethnic country with students descended from Africa, families from Africa or Latin America. Was it right to impose the Western classics on college undergraduates? The so-called hegemonic tradition of white males. Well, I went back to Columbia, as Paul said, because that was the way of studying this particular issue in extremis, because Columbia has two required courses, and still does. One is called Lit-Hum, Literature, Humanities, Lit-Hum, all the kids say, and the other is Contemporary Civilization, and they are classics, Western classics courses, unapologetic, text-based. University of Chicago has its version, Kansas University has its version, Yale, many other schools, sometimes required, often not. At that time, the academic left, in part influenced by Foucault, was describing the Western tradition as some sort of oppressive master narrative. And the right, particularly Lynn Cheney and William Bennett, remember William Bennett, the moralist who kept going off to Las Vegas to play the slot machines? I looked for him when I was there a year ago, January. Cheney and Bennett described Western classics as a kind of armature in the Cold War, which in any case was ending. And I wondered, could the books themselves be as dangerous as the academic left was making them sound, or as boring as the right was making them sound? And it all seemed preposterously removed from the actual experience of reading anything. Reading Greek drama, or Hobbes and Locke and Shakespeare. And so I did sit with the students in several sections of these two courses, and I was deliriously happy. I continued reviewing movies. It was a bit of a scramble, but I got through it. I mean, I took some time off, but not much. But the whole point, I thought, was to fit the reading of these great works into an ordinary bourgeois life in New York. Father, husband, two rambunctious boys climbing all over me while I was trying to read Hegel. Good God, I tell you, I was heroic. It was so much fun, the whole thing. Parenthetically, the Founding Fathers were steeped in the humanities, in this stuff in particular, up to 1780. Greek philosophy and political theory, biblical texts, of course. 17th century political theory, Hobbes and Locke, 18th century Hume and Adam Smith. They were deists, Christian believers who believed that God created everything and then absented himself from the scene. That's why you needed a constitution. You were on your own. They were steeped in the humanities. Anyway, it was a great joy. And I discovered a few things. The so-called hegemonic tradition, at least the way Columbia teaches it, was not some uniform, triumphal narrative of the West's, ascension, but actually a procession of writers who were often at odds with one another, revising, quarreling, overturning. Aristotle has a very different idea about the forms of things than his teacher, Plato. Montaigne celebrates the body and all of its manifestations after hundreds of years of Christian writing very suspicious of the body. Marx turns Hegel, who was standing on his head, back up, right side up again, as Marx said. Anyway, that was the way Columbia taught the books. At second, they were teachers. The teachers come from all different courses, all different disciplines, immersed in modern masterpieces like by Ibsen and Joyce and Eliot and Kafka. And so they brought out the discordancies and dissonances in the text, the unresolved elements. In the ninth book of the Iliad, Achilles has been sulking in his tent. He's, withdrawn from the fight because his slave girl has been robbed by the king, and he won't fight anymore, and the ambassadors go to see him. And he makes a very strange speech, saying every man, the cowards as well as the heroes, has his own relation to Zeus. It's all personal matter, this honor stuff. Why am I fighting for these men? It seems that speech and what he says there seems at odds with the whole rest of this incredibly violent poem, the Iliad, which is based on honor and shame. He says no, it's an individual matter. Now, what was inculcated in students at Columbia and probably anywhere else that this kind of thing becomes specialized courses is the very opposite of reflexive triumphalism or a withdrawal into a fortress of superiority. It's closer to reflexive self-criticism and continuous revision. That was the heart of the liberal reading of the classics that I tried to pull off. And as I read, parts of my own past came into focus, because I was now 48, having been 18 the first time I read them, or supposedly read them, all of them. And I was a husband and father, job holder, and New York bourgeois. So Oedipus killing his father and sleeping with his mother and then putting out his eyes shocked me a great deal, Oedipus Rex, Sophocles' version. But at 48, it seemed, reading it metaphorically, it seemed more like an inevitable effect of becoming a powerful adult, or even somewhat powerful adult, just a husband and father, that inevitably you're cut off from some part of yourself you don't see, inevitably. That was enlightening. Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which seemed to be just like a total soft fog when I read it at 18, actually is structured like with steel girders, that kind of thing. And there were things I had never read before, changes in the reading lists that were exciting. Euripides' The Bacchae is one of the most mischievous and complex works of art ever. It's as much as any modern text. Well, what I was fretting about in 1990-91 when this project started was Philistinism and politicization, theory-based political attack on the Western classics from within the university, and the threatened neglect of the books as art and thought, and correspondingly the bluntly instrumental Lynn Cheney, William Bennett defense of Western classics as some sort of armature, some sort of patriotic shield. 20 years later, 2011, there was a more fundamental issue, for me at least. How much were kids reading? Teenagers. I mean, reading seriously. They're probably reading more words than ever before because they're reading on screens all the time. They're also looking at their cell phones all the time. Sherry Turkle, an MIT professor, psychology and sociology both, has written 2 books. She talked to a lot of people, a lot of kids in particular, voicing her concern that kids are mediating their lives with this device. She holds office hours. She's a very friendly person, and nobody comes. It's not that students aren't interested in having contact with her. They only want to deal with her through email. They won't face her. And she's shocked at how many kids are constantly mediating their relationships, even friendships and even romantic relationships, through texting and other things. And her point is that it's when you face someone eye to eye, if you're 14 or 15 or 16 in particular, that's the moment of growth, of recognition, of self-knowledge, of knowledge of other people, and that was a terrible thing to lose. Anyway, because they're so terribly busy, no Huckleberry Finns lazing their way down the Mississippi. School, sports, homework, jobs, parents, friendships, love affairs, TV, music, social networking, cell phones, video games, texting. Their lives are so busy, and for many perilous, emotionally driven and riven, sitting with a book under a tree or on the back porch may seem low on the list of wants. I mean, when they were young, obviously millions read Harry Potter. As teens, they may read dystopian science fiction novels, vampire romance, graphic novels, and a few, of course, read Jane Eyre. It was always a minority. Now it's a smaller minority. But by the time they're 15 or 16 in their actual studies of this, reading for pleasure drops off as kids push towards 17. Reading anything more serious threatens to cut off their smartphone sense of being in touch with everyone and everything at the same time. Suddenly they're not everywhere. They're there on that page and that time. They're moored. They're limited. Of course, that's what I love about reading. You shut out everything. But that provokes anxiety in a lot of teenagers. Certainly not pleasure. It's always about pleasure for me. That's what I've been trying to, how do you find pleasure in serious things? That's what I've been trying to do with my criticism and these education books. Of course, if you hold your child from the age of 0 and start reading even before they can possibly understand anything, and mix the reading experience with affection and warmth and all of that, you're giving your kids an enormous gift. Not just will they do better in school, they're possibly giving them an entryway into paradise. You can't ever be alone, my mother used to say, if you love to read. Well, you are running up against not just the busyness of teenage life and the anxieties and so on, but a kind of cultural prejudice now. If they're thinking of college, they may have been told from their elders, even Barack Obama, that liberal arts education and the humanities are relatively a waste of time. The economy demands skill sets defined narrowly as, in many places, as technical skills, the STEM subjects. Now, studying art history is not going to get you anywhere. This may be literal nonsense. Yeah, of course we need a technically qualified workforce, but there are a lot of corporate leaders, I've read this stuff, who will say things like, well, yeah, we can teach them the computer skills they need in 3 months or less. We want three-dimensional people. We want people who can read a memo, write a memo, stand up in a meeting and talk, lead a group. A lot of corporate work is group work now. People can think and judge and express themselves. They can always buy robots. We don't need to create human versions. The liberal arts in general, and especially reading seriously, offers an opening to wider pleasures, a wider life, better jobs, the powers of active citizenship. They strengthen perception, judgment, character. They create understanding of other people and oneself, maybe kindliness and wit too, certainly the ability to function well at work, and to endure solitude, both in the common sense of empty room loneliness and the cosmic sense of empty universe loneliness. So I wanted to attack the problem. My talent is not for deep thinking or philosophy, but for flying low. I wanted to attack at the practical level, so I used the same strategy as the Columbia book. I sat in a single English classroom, 10th grade, 15-year-olds, for an entire year, every class. It was great. I like being around students. The school was a public school in Manhattan called Beacon. It used to be west of Lincoln Center. It's now in a bigger building downtown. The building that they were in was absurdly cramped. It was never intended as a school. Kids were all over each other, 1,300 kids in a small building. But it had good students, interesting students, very good teachers, and a lot of computers. The gym was so small that if you tried a jump shot from more than 10 feet, the ball would hit the ceiling. The library was bigger. Ethnically mixed in family income. There were upper middle class kids from Park Slope and the Upper West Side, but there were a lot of kids from the outer boroughs, not from Staten Island, but from Queens, the outer boroughs, as we Manhattan people say. Brooklyn, of course, the Bronx. The teacher, unfortunately, is not there anymore. He's gone back to Louisiana, which is where he comes from. It's a man named Sean Leon. And he had an unusual reading list. No Mark Twain, no Shakespeare, which disappointed me, but he chose texts that he called it an existential reading list. There were texts that forced the issue of identity. Who are you? What do you live for? What matters to you? Hawthorne's stories, particularly The Minister's Black Veil. Try that one. Stunning. Sylvia Plath's poetry. Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, which I could have done without. And then a colossus, Dostoevsky's short novel, Notes from Underground. He wrote just before Crime and Punishment, and the other. Incredible book. Now I tracked the students as well as I could. There were 33 of them. You can't make 33 characters, so I selected a few and tried to follow them and talk to them and whenever I could. Some of them really became readers. I mean, they flourished under this kind of reading list, and there were classes that made me a little bit uncomfortable, I have to admit, because Mr. Leon wasn't group therapy, but he would get them to confront each other and talk in a very personal way to each other. And then it would come back to the text, whatever it was that we were reading. Not exactly advanced literary study, but it was a way of getting 15-year-olds to read. And I went to 2 other schools, and I'll make this very brief because I'd just go on forever. I went up to New Haven to a big urban school with very poor kids for the most part, mainly African-American kids, in drawing from some of the depressed neighborhoods in New Haven. New Haven is a schizophrenic place, a magnificent university, fantastic hospital system, and not much work elsewise. The industry has fled years ago. Anyway, and these kids, and the teacher's name was Jessica Zelensky, a real pistol. At first, they didn't want to read at all. They couldn't see the point of it. They could see the point of biology. They could see the point of physics, math. What was the point of reading plays, poems, poetry? They simply wouldn't do the reading. So Jessica got them to read through To Kill a Mockingbird in class. They took turns analyzing it. And she got them to connect with Mayella, the young woman. By the end of the year, they were doing much better. And they had to choose an individual text to read, some among 4 that she gave them. And one was Night by Elie Wiesel. And another was a book called A Long Way Gone by Ishmael Bey. Ishmael Bey was a boy soldier in Sierra Leone, and he came to the United States, went to Oberlin, had a great writing teacher, and has written, book I recommend to you absolutely, A Long Way Gone, his adventures, hair-raising adventures as a boy soldier. He fought first on one side and then on the other side. And that many people were excited by. And then a little miracle happened. Ishmael Bey showed up. Nothing to do with the class, or me, or Jessica. He showed up in New Haven to give a talk, and so the teacher was able to bring her students to see a real live author. And that was exciting, moving to many people. And then finally I went to a very affluent community, Mamaroneck, which is a so-called bedroom town north of New York, a high-tax area, very good school system. But about 5 years ago, the teachers and the principal realized that a lot of the kids, particularly the boys, were not doing the reading, just weren't doing it. They would read the study guides online, some of which are dismayingly competent, probably written by impoverished graduate students at Western Michigan University. You don't have to read Macbeth, and you can read Spark Notes, right? And get through the exam. So instead of lecturing them and sequestering the bad ones or whatever, they did something else. And they're not the only ones who are doing it. There are people doing it. They didn't kill their traditional reading list. They still read in 10th grade Robert Frost and The Great Gatsby, like that. Macbeth, I think. Yes, definitely Macbeth. But they also insisted that the students, all of them, keep a book of their own choosing going at all times. You could read anything you want. I mean, it couldn't be outright trash, but you could. And the teachers would actually present books, popular literature sometimes, which meant the teachers had to work very hard. They had to take recommendations from each other. They had to keep track of the bestseller list. They could get the books from anywhere, from the library, from the schools rich enough to have a library in each room, from the trash can. That wasn't the point. And when they finished, they had to start another and keep going. They were logged in. Well, what if they keep reading the same kind of book over and over again? Which, of course, is what happens. People get turned on to, say, romance fiction. They want to read a series of 10 books by the same author. Or guys want to keep reading military stuff, military fiction, or reporting. The teacher will take them aside and say, well, I see you're interested in horror fiction. That's fine. You don't judge their tastes. You don't censor their passions. That's fine. Let me tell you about this guy named Stephen King. He's really quite good. Push them towards that. Or even Robert Louis Stevenson wrote a book called Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or like that. In other words, it's called laddering. Take their interests, where they're engaged, and try to push them up into greater complexity, greater difficulty, and greater pleasure. And it works in some cases, and I have some funny stories about when it didn't work and when it works. But the teachers of that school and the principal, they weren't just trying to make better students. They were that too, but they were saying that you're cheating yourself if you're not reading. The things that teachers always say to students, but they really meant that if you became a lifetime reader, you were on a road to some kind of personal salvation. And I can just give you one final anecdote of my own. If you've noticed that my right eye has closed, I'm not flirting with you. I had a damaged retina, and I had an eye operation a few years ago. The operation went smoothly enough, but the recovery is a kind of medieval hell for a sort of jiggling sort of person like myself. They insert a gas bubble in your eye, which heals the wound by pressing upward. And in order to effect that cure, you have to keep your head down for like a week, embedding it in a kind of rubberized, large plastic, large donut. It's terrible. The gas bubble in your eye is like having your own personal science fiction movie. It's absolutely beautiful. It's like a globe, and it glows, and it's different colors. It's iridescent. Finally gets smaller. But I listened to music because I was going crazy, and then I began listening to fiction, and I listened to Jane Austen's Emma, which I hadn't read since school, and Emma is set in Highbury, not a real English town of 1815, but a literary creation of Jane Austen's. And in some ways, it's an ideal small society, at least for Emma, who's a brilliant, arrogant young woman, and who eagerly consorts with a few landowners who are of her social station, including Mr. Knightley, and Frank Churchill, a dashing young man who's around, and others. Now, the men in this little closed society don't do much work. Knightley manages his estates and runs off to London, and others manage land for the most part, if they work at all. It's essentially a society at leisure, addicted to such body comforts as eating and talking and occasionally dancing. And as I listened to this book being read, I'm trapped in my own constricted society. I heard in the constant fussing and organizing and reorganizing of Highbury social life the fear that lay behind all this fuss, the fear not just of inconvenience and discomfort, but of loneliness, isolation. And the fear of isolation and also of the outside world there's a strange scene that Austen creates in which Emma's friend Harriet Smith is assailed by some begging gypsy children encountered on the road. in between the propertied estates. And she's rescued by Frank Churchill, and who conveys her to Emma's house, where she faints. And they are all shocked by the unimaginable intrusion of strangers, supposedly menacing strangers, into Highbury. Well, after reading that, I wondered what anyone from Highbury would make of New York. This was 2015. At the hospital for my operation, I was admitted by an African-American woman. The male orderlies were Latino. The two prep nurses upstairs were a Chinese woman who called me Denby David, and an irritable Indian immigrant who was complaining about the New York school system. The anesthesiologist who came to talk to me in advance of the operation was a white woman from the United States. The nurses in the operating room, both male and female, were Filipino. And my doctor, the surgeon, was a woman in her late 30s, born in Nigeria, raised in New Jersey, and educated at Princeton and Cornell. Well, they all handled Denby David with great professional skill, and I realized I was lying there on my back having this operation and looking up, that I was lucky, not only for the concentrated attention directed at one patient, but lucky that in New York town there was not a fixed and frightened society, but many hard-working and highly trained immigrants. And in some ways, it may be the future of the country. So, thank you very much for listening. Now, thank you. All right, I'll stay. Snow and I talk so long that I don't know what where's the guy with the clock? What do you say? Do we have time? I hope we have time. Okay. Okay. There's always this dreadful silence. Who wants to go first? Yeah, we are.
When you first started speaking, you said on MSNBC you saw someone go on a bit of a tirade for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Who was that? Because I want to pull it up.
Chuck Todd.
Chuck Todd?
At 5 o'clock. Today, 5 o'clock. That's the way he started. He went on and on and on. He got high from it.
I'll enjoy it.
It was like network,
Yeah, great.
Yes.
When you were visiting the high schools,
Yeah.
was your presence somewhat intimidating both to the teacher and the students at times?
Well, I mentioned Fred Wiseman before, the great documentary filmmaker, and I always ask him that question. When you're in there with a camera, I mean, he comes just with himself and a sound guy. I mean, at most 3 people. And he said, most people don't have that many alternative behaviors. And if they're under pressure, they tend to fall back on what they're familiar with and comfortable with. I think, I mean, I'm being effusive and everything now, but normally I'm a mouse. I mean, I would just sit on the side of the room with my back sit on a table in the high school class, and, with books all around me, and just sit there and take notes. And the kids are very concerned with performing, so they're worried about the teacher's opinion, not mine. That was, the African American kids in New Haven were very eager to talk, and I said, well, of course I'm not going to use any of your names. And they said, oh no, we want you to use our names, please. But this is, I mean, Michael Wolff also claims to be just an observer in the White House, but I think he played people off against each other. Ivanka says that, well, he didn't talk to Ivanka. Steve says this, like that kind of, that's aggressive reporting. I didn't do anything like that. I would talk to the kids individually in the outside of class, or either before or after in cafeteria, interview them. Those kids who can be, if you sit there with a notebook, any reporter will tell you this, you sit there and turn pages, reporting 101, people open up eventually. Just keep flipping pages. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes?
As a film critic, you might appreciate that, well, maybe not. Over the last year, I felt like I had been trapped inside a Mel Brooks movie gone horribly wrong. About a year ago, Demagogu is part of this, what we're talking about here. About a year ago, when the Trump administration instituted its Muslim ban, which is what it was,
Right.
I mean, what came to my mind was Crystal Knox. I mean, I wasn't there, but I don't know what my history books, but that's exactly what came to mind. And what I find particularly interesting about this whole thing, Muslims are all bad, Islam is bad, they hate us, we should hate them back, everything, okay. Over the past 20, 30 years, the group that has the most terrorist incidents within the United States, and it's not even close, is white supremacists.
Right.
And yet, then at Charlottesville, he calls the neo-Nazis fine people. And
Yes.
of course, he doesn't want to criticize the neo-Nazi who did the ISIS-style attack on the protesters. It just everything. 1984 really comes to mind about the double speak and double think.
Exactly.
That 2 + 2 = 5. And if you don't believe that, or even if you disagree,
You're in trouble.
You're in trouble.
Yeah.
And just one last thing. During the campaign, and this goes to tribal epistemology, the one thing, most horrifying thing of the whole campaign was this random Trump supporter where a reporter asked her, what is it about Trump that you like? What is it? What policy do you follow so much? And she said, I'm for whatever Trump's for.
Right.
No abdication of all political thinking whatsoever.
Is it because in attacking everybody and insulting everybody and going low and being vulgar and sexual and all of that, that people feel it constricted in their own lives? Wait, let me just finish.
Now. And there's a low fanaticism. I've never seen.
Yeah, but is it, I'm trying to get at the why, is it because he's acting out the way people would like to act, and they know they would get fired or censured if they did act that way? Is that part of the attraction? I don't know. Speaking about 1984, you remember there's the totalitarian regime has possibly invented this character called Goldstein, and the government workers and maybe just the ordinary citizens are assembled for hate sessions every month or so, and they see a big picture of Goldstein and everyone chants and jeers, Hillary! She's become Goldstein.
Yeah.
I mean, she's not doing anything, and she's constantly creating conspiracies, according to Sean Hannity. It's quite remarkable. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
What I heard is people saying he tells the truth. It's not this polished PR guy. He tells the truth. That's what I heard.
Well, because they think insulting people is telling the truth, right? I mean, that's become the definition of truth. I mean, it's tolerance and simple respect. You know, it's funny. I mean, in the 60s, I mentioned I was in anti-war protests, like a lot of young people. There was a lot of acting out, putting it mildly. Yes. At the March on the Pentagon, which Mailer wrote this great book about, Armies of the Night, I mean, all kinds of just hilarious, strange things happened, like Allen Ginsberg and hippies and people in sort of junk Hindu costumes showed up and tried to elevate the Pentagon with chants and 300 feet, and and of course the whole counterculture, not to mention radical left and so on, acting out on the left. It's gone into reverse.
Yeah.
Those Trump rallies are the counterculture of the right. I mean, people screaming and carrying on and enjoying someone getting beat up and enjoying Trump taunting everybody. Whereas the left, with increasing humorlessness and desperation sometimes, is trying to establish elementary tolerance for people who are different from you. Complete reverse behavior. Yes,
You quoted Hannah Arendt.
sure.
Earlier. I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I've thought of her as a sort of a footnote to Martin Heidegger. What could you recommend as something to read of her in order to understand her perspective more?
Well, this book that I mentioned, Origins of Totalitarianism, it's heavy going, but I remember it being thrilled by it and feeling that the scales had dropped from my eyes and I understood a lot of things that I never had before. But she wrote a lot else about power and violence. I'm trying to think of them. There's several collections. A lot of the pieces appeared as magazine articles in the New Yorker and the New York Review in the 60s. But that's the masterwork, which I think has stood the test of time. Oh, then there's, of course, the notorious book Eichmann in Jerusalem, where she went to the Eichmann trial in Israel and reported on it and described what she called the banality of evil. And in just one paragraph or two paragraphs complained about the Jewish elders in Eastern Europe and communities who made it easier for the Nazis by assembling lists of names. Instead, in her opinion, they should have resisted in every way, fought, and this caused, there was an enormous uproar of debate about that. So that's that book, but it's a good book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, yeah.
I don't know if you're willing to make a prediction, but what do you think? What do you see happening with Trump and his administration? Do you think he'll make it the whole 4 years?
I think women are rescuing us from perdition.
Yes.
Yeah. But I have some complicated feelings about Me Too, and about all these men who have been... The scoundrels deserve to be kicked in the nuts and thrown out. Absolutely. But remember, we should be able to keep several things in our head at the same time. Proposition number one, women have been treated like crap in the workplace and various other places, forever. And it has to stop. And there has to be workplace rules, and the HR departments and big organizations have to respect the client, work for the workers, the staff, not just for the bosses. Absolutely agree. At the same time, most accusations by women of men are true, more than 90%, but not every single one is true, and there are even instances I could name. So we still have to judge each one in terms of how credible is it, what's the evidence, how likely is, the benefit of the doubt is entirely on the women's side at this point, and that's fine. But it's not an automatic judgment, I think. Third thing that we should try to keep in mind at the same time is that, what Matt Damon said and got pilloried for, and I think a lot of people said, there has to be some sort of distinctions between rape, near rape, lewd remarks, harassment, lewd remarks, and so on. That they're different kinds of bad behavior, but they shouldn't all be punished with ruin. And that's hard. This is an exciting moment and a liberating moment, and for men too, as well as for women. But I'm a little bit afraid of the atmosphere and how it's going to affect the movies and the arts. But that's a whole other story. And finally, I don't think that men who have misbehaved, if they're artists, that their works should be crushed. I don't believe in this cleansing of the past according to our present standards of behavior. I think there are people actively trying to destroy Woody Allen. Now, we don't know what happened between Woody Allen and his 7-year-old daughter. And I think that isn't fair. I don't believe in retrospective altering of judgment. If those movies like Manhattan were corrupt when they came out, we should have said so at the time. Yes, of course, you can't stop yourself from reinterpreting, but reevaluating, Manhattan's still a very good movie. Yes. Yeah. So, you know, where do you stop? I mean, people have been talking about Chuck Close, paraplegic artist who asked models to undress. As I recall, Matisse made the same mistake. But Picasso, Wagner, you don't want to know how Marcel Proust got off. You really don't want to know. Yes?
I was going to ask you, you had mentioned that one of the discussions they were having is the difference of teaching Western classics
Sure.
versus a varied culture. And then you also talked about the founding fathers and they had this strong classical background. However, when you see what they wrote, which is wonderful, right?
Sure.
And but how they lived in their lives.
Right. Slaveholders.
Dressing,
Yeah.
the treatment of women,
Yeah.
or whatever. I guess I would say, is there a value in opening up the doors besides the classics, or teaching them in a way that doesn't give people like privilege kind of education, you know, to say,
Well, I mean, I think the
They're
reading
all
lists have changed a lot, you know, and what have been called subjugated narratives, you know, that's a Foucauldian expression, I think. There's courses and disciplines and so on devoted to, you know, literature by women, by blacks, by colonial subjects, and that Columbia, just to be fair to Columbia, they know that it's, you know, it's limited, these two courses, so that you're required to take an additional, the trouble that there's so many required courses, it's hard to build a major or anything outside of your major. You're required to take matching courses in another culture. So you could take African history and African American literature, two matching courses, that kind of thing, as required. I mean, not that course in particular, but something comparable to that. So the canon has been opened up to some degree, but I'm against special pleading, though, on the grounds that a woman wrote this, or, you know, you can't ask people to read boring books.
is there not something subtly that begins to happen when we open the concept of humanities to just not Western culture? Like, isn't, by just naming it and closing it as a world, you know, doesn't that in its own way, in teaching it, kids signing up for it, doesn't that in a way exclude and cause people to define?
Well, you can take whatever else you want. It's only, I mean,
But I mean, the professors and
it's only meant to be as, I mean, I guess you could say a foundation or something to stand on. Right, but you can major in whatever you want after that and take whatever you want. The point is you should know some things that are constitutive of this society, which is currently being dragged through the dirt, as we've been talking about all night. Is it time to? Yeah, it's time. One more? No?
let's say, Debbie Davis.
Thank you.